Today we're going to talk about how to fix scenes that just aren't working. When I first started off in writing, I didn't even really know how to write a scene at all. It was completely an unconscious process for me. I was just putting together the pieces from movies or stories that I had consumed in the past, but I was able to improve my scenes so much when I figured out some of the tactics that we're going to discuss today. So if you feel like one of your scenes is kind of in a bad place and you don't really know how to fix it, then keep watching because that is exactly what we're about to talk about. Okay, so the first main tactic, which is also the most important one, is to make sure the scene is abiding by scene structure. First, the two types of scene structure. The two types of scene structure are what I'm going to call active scenes, and these are the scenes where, the character is going after something is getting in the way, and then something at the end happens which propels them into the next scene. Now the next type is the reactive scene, which I'm going to call the sequel. And this reactive scene is where the character or characters are responding to what has just happened. They're faced with some sort of problem, some dilemma, and they make a decision on how they're going to respond in the future scenes. So let's go into a little more detail on each of these scene types. For the active scene, we have three components that need to be present in each. The first component is the goal. What is the character trying to get in this scene? So for instance, and I'm totally making this example up, so this is not going to be a perfect story or anything by any means, but here it is. Imagine that we have this character and he's this young guy. He's living in this apartment building and recently he's met one of his neighbors and it's this girl that he's attracted to. It seemed like they had some sort of chemistry. So maybe his goal in the scene is to find a way to run into this love interest before he goes to work and set up a date or something. So that's the goal for the scene. And because of it, we know exactly what the character wants. And if things are moving them away or closer to that goal, we'll be able to feel that and be able to root for the character. Now, the next component of the active scene is called the conflict or reversal. Basically, this is when some sort of obstacle gets in the way of the character achieving their goal. So in our little romance example, maybe the conflict is that he gets a call from work and it's his boss and he tells him that he has to get in now. So he can't wait out in front of his apartment any longer. So that's our conflict. He has to balance these two things. Either he's going to wait longer and see if she shows up so that he can set up this date, or he's going to go to work immediately. Now, the next component of the active scene is called the unexpected outcome. And this is where something happens at the end of the scene which defines whether the character is going to reach that goal that they were striving for at the beginning of the scene. And this unexpected outcome is important because it will determine how the story is going to move forward afterward. So maybe in our little romance example, our viewpoint character decides that he's gonna just have to go to work. He can't wait around any longer. So he goes down the stairs, he goes out the door, and who does he see right there? It's the love interest. But she's not right in front of the door, she's actually over there on the sidewalk. He starts to walk over to her, but when he walks closer, right around the corner, there's another guy talking to her already. He seems really close to her. He seems like he might be a boyfriend. So in the beginning of the scene, his goal was to meet with this girl and talk to her and set up a date. But after the unexpected outcome, he's not really sure what to do. And one thing to note about the unexpected outcome is that this is the main thing that's going to move the story forward into the next scene. So those are the main components of the active scene. And after this unexpected outcome, our protagonist, our romance character, is going to have to decide what he's going to do next. And that brings us to the next type of scene, which is the sequel. In the sequel, there are three components as well. There are the reaction, which is where the character or characters are airing out their reactions to the last scene. So in our example, maybe he's walking to work and he's thinking about how he's jealous, or he's having a reaction of intimidation, or he's having a reaction of rebellion. Even if this guy is her boyfriend, I don't care. Whatever it is, the character is having some sort of reaction to the events in the previous scene or scenes. Now, the next component of this reactive scene, of this sequel, is the dilemma. And this is where the character has to grapple with some sort of problem that has been raised as a result of the unexpected outcome. So in our case, maybe it's a moral dilemma. If that actually is her boyfriend, maybe our character doesn't want to interfere or get her to cheat on him. And that leads us to the very last component of the sequel, the decision. And this is where the character or characters decide what they're going to do, which leads us to the next scene's goal. So in our example, maybe our character decides, I'm just gonna have to meet some other people for now because I don't want to interfere if they're actually a couple. Or maybe he decides that he's going to find out who this guy is so that he knows if he's in the right or the wrong. So I hope that's given you a good understanding of scene structure, but one thing that's important for us to discuss is what will happen if you're missing any of these elements in your scenes. This way you can kind of figure out where your scenes may be lacking already. Now this is only really relevant to the active scene because with sequels, sometimes you don't even have them at all. Sometimes you don't have all the elements of them. You don't need all the elements of them. If it was just like a simple case, in our little example, say that later on in the book, they're going to a river together on some sort of date and she falls into the river. We're not gonna need a sequel scene for him to react and for him to decide, oh, am I gonna jump in the water and try to help her? He's just gonna jump in. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get on to the active scene and what is important about each of these components. First, the goal. If the character doesn't have a clear goal in the scene, then the reader is gonna have a hard time knowing what to be rooting for. The reader needs to understand what the character wants so that they can monitor the character's progress throughout the scene and know what's moving them toward the goal or what's moving them away from it. Now, if your scene contains a weak conflict or doesn't have a conflict at all, it'll just feel really flat. It's just A to B. It's too simple. It doesn't really seem real. The character hasn't had to overcome any sort of obstacle to get to the end of the scene. And if your scene is missing the unexpected outcome, then there won't be anything to propel it forward into the next scene in the book. So if you feel like your scenes are often missing some of these elements, it might be a good idea to focus on deciding what each of these elements will be before you write the scene, so that you know you're hitting each one of these. I will repeat again, this is one of the most important things that I'm going to talk about in this video. This was seriously a game changer for me. And that is exactly what this channel is about. It's about me taking you along with me on this journey to become a better writer and sharing with you the things that I'm learning along the way. So I'm happy you're here, and let's get on to that next tactic. Next, make sure your scene includes all the narrative modes. Different writers have different natural tendencies, and it's easy to get caught up in one or another of these modes, whether it's dialogue, action, exposition, description, or character thought. Whatever you naturally tend toward, make sure that you account for it when you're editing so you're not overly leaning toward one of these narrative modes and avoiding all the others. So if you're looking into your scenes and trying to figure out what could be going wrong, one way that you can check the narrative modes is to go through and start highlighting each of the modes. So if you find it difficult to identify all 5 narrative modes separately, you can identify 3 different categories instead: action, dialogue and character thought, and exposition and description. By highlighting each of these categories in your scene, you can get a really good visual idea of what the balance is currently, and you can see if you're leaning too much toward one or the other. And the next tactic is to focus on one thing per scene. When I'm talking about focusing on only one thing, what I really mean is focusing only on one character goal throughout the entire length of the scene. So in a romance example, you can imagine that it would start to get a little confusing if our character had many goals in this first scene instead of just the one. So maybe he has the goal that he's going to find a way to run into this girl and set up a date with her, but maybe he also has the goal of like negotiating with somebody at his job, or maybe he also has the goal of resolving a conflict between his family. It's going to start to get a little confusing for the reader because this character is trying to do all of these things in this one scene and they don't really know where things are going. Like we said with the goal, having one goal is important because it gives the reader a sense of what to focus on and how to know if they're moving toward that goal or not. So it is vitally important to focus on just one character goal. And one thing I'd like you to focus on is smashing that like button if you're enjoying this video so that YouTube knows to share it with more writers like you. And the next tactic is to make sure that the other characters in your scenes have goals too. Now, this might seem kind of simple and you would think that everybody does this automatically, but it can be really easy as a writer to forget about thinking about the other character's goals when you're going into writing a scene. And if you don't think about the character's goals, then it can be really easy to just assume that their goals are something that the protagonist will be happy about. But that's not the best way to make your scenes really interesting. You want the characters to each have their own goals, their own perspectives, their own lives, so that they're influencing and conflicting with each other. So back to our favorite romance example, you know we were coming back. It is... So imagine if at the end of the scene, after he sees the two together, he decides that he's going to go talk to them. And we can tell already, just knowing the goals of these two characters, that they will greatly impact the outcome of the scene. Say for instance that the love interest character, she's friends with this guy, but she doesn't really think of him as anything else but a friend, you know? She just wanted him to help her with something in the morning before she went to work. Maybe the friend character actually likes her though, and because of that, he doesn't really like this new guy, our viewpoint character. He thinks this guy is not right for her, and he is not going to support them at all. He's totally going to try to interfere as much as possible. And since each of these characters has goals that run against the others, it's easy to see how they could lead to conflict. So you can see how having goals for characters outside of your viewpoint character is vitally important to making your scenes feel real and making the characters in them feel congruent, like actual people. Now, for our very last tactic, we want to make sure that our scenes feel different from each other. And with this last example, we're gonna take a break from our romance example because I have an actual example from my own life here. Back in an older version of the story that I'm currently writing, I had two scenes that ended up being relatively similar to each other. And these were actually major turning points of the story. At the first plot point, I had the antagonist kidnapping the mentor character. And at the midpoint, I had the antagonist taking the protagonist captive too. Neither of these points is in the story anymore. But at the time, I realized that they were far too similar to both be present. And I knew this second scene wouldn't be as interesting as it could be because it would feel repetitive to the reader. So if you feel like you may have two scenes that are too similar, how can we actually go about fixing this? Consider the major elements of each of these scenes. This could be setting, the characters involved, the scene structure itself, remember the goal, conflict, and unexpected outcome. This could be the stakes of the scene. What is at stake for the characters present in the scene, as well as the characters that they care about and that rely on them. Make sure to note down the various components of the two scenes that you're looking at and figure out which ways you could change one of these scenes to make it more interesting and different from the other. And on that note, one of the most important scenes to perfect in your book is the opening hook. So if you want to learn how to write a riveting hook, click here. I don't know. That was supposed to symbolize like 10 things pointing to it. I'm telling you how much you should click on that. Come on.